The invisible garden. Nobody could see what I was growing inside. I was raised by my grandmother in a small apartment above her flower shop. My father left when I was a baby. My mother died when I was 8. I have only one photograph of her, smiling among roses. Grandmother never spoke of my parents. When I asked about them, she would say, "The past is behind us. We look forward." I stopped asking after a while. Our apartment was filled with plants, ferns hanging from the ceiling, cacti lined on windowsills, flowers blooming in every corner. The scent of soil and greenery was our constant companion. Few people visited our private space above the shop. Grandmother worked long hours in her store. She arranged bouquets, advised customers on plant care, and maintained her small empire of flowers. She came upstairs tired, but always took time to water every plant before sleeping. I watched and learned in silence. I spent my free time reading plant encyclopedias and helping in the shop. When other children played in the streets, I studied the language of flowers, learning which blooms meant courage, which stood for remembrance, which symbolized hope. The quiet world of plants made sense to me in ways people never did. At school, I was invisible. While classmates formed tight groups and shared secrets, I remained apart, like a different species altogether. I completed my assignments meticulously, answered questions when called upon, and disappeared as soon as the bell rang. Some teachers tried to draw me out, but I retreated further inward. I didn't know how to connect. My grandmother said, "Some people are like annuals. They bloom briefly and move on. Better to be a perennial and stand your ground." I took her words to heart. Boys occasionally noticed me, the strange, quiet girl who knew everything about plants but nothing about socializing. They would approach with curiosity, but I couldn't maintain their interest. I watched them from a distance, how they moved in packs, how quickly their attention shifted from one girl to another. They seemed as fleeting as spring blossoms. I convinced myself I was better rooted alone. I focused on my studies, particularly botany and horticulture. After graduation, I joined my grandmother in the shop full-time, learning the business side of plants. Our days followed the same pattern. Open the shop at dawn, arrange flowers, serve customers, close at dusk, tend to our own jungle upstairs. Years passed this way, predictable and safe. If not fulfilling, at least it was familiar. I thought this would be my entire life, surrounded by plants that never judged, never left, never demanded more than water and light. I had accepted this solitary existence, until the day that changed everything. It was an ordinary Tuesday in early spring. The shop smelled of fresh lilies and damp soil. I was arranging a wedding bouquet, white roses and baby's breath, while my grandmother helped a customer select houseplants. The bell above the door chimed, and I glanced up briefly before returning to my work. Customers were my grandmother's domain. "Excuse me? I need help with something specific." His voice was warm and deep, like rich garden soil. I continued working, assuming my grandmother would assist him. "My colleague is busy at the moment," I heard her say, "but my granddaughter is an expert in rare plants. She can help you." I looked up with surprise. My grandmother never directed customers to me for consultations. He was standing by the exotic plant section, examining a pitcher plant with careful interest. He wasn't what I expected, not the usual type who sought unusual plants. He wore a practical jacket with many pockets, dirt under his fingernails despite their otherwise clean appearance. "I'm looking for something that can survive with minimal attention," he said when I approached. "I travel frequently for work." I nodded, already cataloging options in my mind. How much light does your home get? North-facing windows, moderate light. I selected a few plants, a snake plant, ZZ plant, and a particular type of philodendron, explaining the care requirements for each. He listened attentively, asking intelligent questions that revealed some prior knowledge. You know plants, I observed. I'm a botanical photographer, he explained. I document rare species, but I'm terrible at keeping them alive at home. After he made his selection, the philodendron, I expected him to leave. Instead, he lingered, examining other plants with genuine interest. Would you mind if I came back tomorrow? I'd like to see your orchid collection in better light. I glanced at my grandmother, who was pretending not to listen. The shop is open daily, I replied neutrally. He returned the next day and the day after. Sometimes he purchased small plants or supplies. Sometimes he just observed. My grandmother noticed his regular appearances but said nothing, though I caught her hiding smiles when she thought I wasn't looking. One evening, as I was walking through the community garden where I volunteered, I spotted him photographing a rare flowering vine that grew there. I considered turning around, but curiosity pulled me forward. Do you know what this is? He asked without looking up from his camera. Passiflora incarnata, I replied. Passion flower, native to this region but increasingly uncommon. He lowered his camera and smiled. Most people just call it pretty. We walked through the garden together as the setting sun cast long shadows between the rows of vegetables and flowering plants. For once, silence felt comfortable rather than necessary. I told myself he would lose interest in our shop, in the plants, in these conversations. Customers always moved on, but he continued visiting, sometimes bringing photographs of plants he'd encountered in his travels, sometimes asking questions about cultivation techniques. One morning, he brought coffee in 2 ceramic mugs, not disposable cups. I remembered your grandmother mentioning you prefer ceramic over paper, he said, placing one mug on the counter near me. I stared at it, surprised he had noticed such a detail. Thank you, I said, the words feeling strange on my tongue. I added cardamom, he said. It complements the Ethiopian beans. I took a careful sip. The flavor was rich and complex. It's good, I admitted. He smiled, and something shifted imperceptibly in the air between us. He began bringing coffee regularly, always in ceramic mugs, always with some new flavor note for me to discover. My grandmother observed this ritual with poorly concealed approval. He notices things, she said one evening as we watered our apartment jungle. That's rare. I pretended not to understand her meaning, but I did. He noticed things others didn't, which plants had new growth, which arrangements I had created versus my grandmother's, how I always touched my pendant when discussing rare specimens. He noticed me, when I had spent a lifetime being invisible. One Saturday, he arrived with his camera. Would you mind if I photographed some of your arrangements? They have a distinctive quality. I hesitated, uncomfortable with attention. They're just flowers. No, he said seriously. They're stories. Each arrangement speaks differently. That afternoon, as he photographed my work, he asked questions about my process, my inspiration, my techniques. No one had ever shown interest in my creative decisions before. As weeks passed, he became a fixture in the shop. He would arrive with coffee, spend time photographing or simply talking, then leave with a small purchase. Sometimes, in quiet moments, he would help me repot plants or clean leaves. Tasks he clearly knew how to perform despite his claims of being hopeless with houseplants. Why do you keep coming back? I finally asked one rainy afternoon as we worked side by side, transplanting seedlings. He considered the question seriously. Because I see something growing here that interests me. What plants? I asked, confused. He smiled gently. Not plants. I didn't know how to respond, so I focused on the seedlings. My cheeks warmed despite the shop's cool air. That evening, my grandmother said something unexpected as we closed the shop. Not all growth is visible to the eye, she said, touching a seemingly dormant orchid. Sometimes the most important development happens beneath the surface. I understood her metaphor, but couldn't acknowledge it. The possibility of opening myself to another person terrified me more than any plant disease or pest. The following week, he didn't come. I told myself it was inevitable. His interest had finally waned. I worked mechanically, arranging flowers without my usual care, checking the door despite myself whenever the bell chimed. My grandmother noticed but said nothing, giving me space to process emotions I couldn't name. On the fourth day of his absence, a package arrived. A small, carefully wrapped box with my name written in unfamiliar handwriting. Inside was a glass terrarium, miniature and perfect, containing tiny plants and mosses arranged to create a microscopic landscape. A note accompanied it. Some gardens are small enough to hold in your hands, yet contain entire worlds. I'm photographing alpine flora this week, back soon. I placed the terrarium on my windowsill, examining how light played through its glass walls, illuminating the tiny ecosystem within. That night, I realized I was smiling without reason while watering my plants. He returned the following Monday, bringing coffee and photographs of mountain flowers clinging to rocky outcrops. As he showed me the images, I noticed his enthusiasm, the way his eyes brightened when describing the resilience of these plants surviving in harsh conditions. "They remind me of you," he said suddenly. I looked up, startled. "Cold and rocky?" He laughed. "Strong, thriving where others can't, beautiful in unexpected ways." No one had ever called me beautiful before. I didn't know how to respond, so I pointed to another photograph, asking about the species shown. He allowed the moment to pass, continuing with his explanations without pressing for a reaction. Days turned to weeks. His visits became longer, our conversations deeper. He would bring books about plants he'd encountered in distant countries, sharing stories of forests and deserts and mountain meadows. I found myself speaking more than I ever had before, sharing knowledge I'd accumulated over years of quiet observation. One evening, as we walked through the community garden after closing the shop, he asked, "Have you ever traveled?" I shook my head. "I've never left the city." "Would you want to? See different plants in their natural habitats?" The question stirred something inside me, a longing I hadn't allowed myself to acknowledge. "I have responsibilities here. The shop—" "It was just a question," he said gently, "not a proposal." But his words planted a seed in my mind that refused to lie dormant. That night, my grandmother found me on our small balcony, surrounded by potted herbs, staring at the stars. "You're different lately," she said, settling into the chair beside mine. "No, I'm the same," I insisted. She shook her head slowly. "I've watched you grow your entire life. I know when new buds are forming." I remained silent, uncomfortable with her perception. "Some plants need to be replanted to reach their full potential," she said after a while. "Their roots become too constrained." "The shop is my home," I replied. "A home shouldn't be a pot that limits you." Her words stayed with me through a restless night. The next day, he arrived with excitement visible in his movements. "I've been commissioned to document endangered orchid species in cloud forests. 3 weeks, leaving next month." I felt an unexpected hollowness at the thought of his absence. "That sounds like an amazing opportunity," It is, he agreed, then hesitated. They've authorized a research assistant, someone who knows orchids. I stared at him, understanding slowly dawning. You're the most knowledgeable person I know on the subject, he continued. Would you consider it? The proposal seemed impossible. Leave the shop? Travel to distant forests? Step completely outside the carefully contained life I'd constructed? I can't, I said automatically. My grandmother needs me here. Do I? My grandmother's voice came from behind me. She had been listening. This shop managed before you were born. It can manage for 3 weeks. But no buts, she said firmly. Some flowers must be given space to bloom. That evening, I sat alone in my room, surrounded by my most treasured plants, feeling as though I stood at the edge of an unfamiliar landscape. The thought of leaving terrified me. The thought of staying suddenly terrified me more. He came the next morning before opening hours. I was alone, preparing arrangements for the day. I don't expect an answer yet, he said. Think about it. The offer remains open. I took a deep breath. If I went, I've never traveled. I wouldn't know what to do, how to act. You would study it like any new plant species, he said with a smile. Observe, learn, adapt. What if I don't fit in that environment? His expression softened. Not all plants thrive in the same conditions, but you might discover environments where you flourish in ways you never imagined. 2 days later, still undecided, I found myself reorganizing the rare plant section. As I worked, I noticed a customer examining our collection of air plants with curious intensity. Can I help you? I asked. The woman turned, revealing a face lined with years. I'm looking for something specific, a plant that reminds me of my homeland. I learned she had left her country decades ago, never to return. Yet she surrounded herself with plants that carried memories of the forests where she had grown up. As she spoke of distant mountains and valleys, her eyes shone with both loss and joy. Plants carry home with us, she said. They remind us where we come from, but they also adapt to new soil, as must we. After she left, I stood motionless among the greenery, her words echoing in my mind. That night, I made my decision. When he arrived the next morning, I simply said, I'll go. His smile was like sunshine after rain. You won't regret it. I might, I admitted honestly. I've never done anything like this. That's exactly why you should. The weeks before departure passed in a blur of preparations. My grandmother helped me select appropriate clothing, insisting on practical items I would never have chosen myself. She showed no sadness at my impending absence, only a quiet pride that confused and comforted me equally. The night before leaving, I couldn't sleep. I moved through our apartment, touching each plant, whispering instructions to my grandmother, though she knew their needs better than anyone. They'll be here when you return, she assured me, as will I. But you'll be different. What if I don't want to be different? I asked, voicing my deepest fear. She took my hands in hers, her skin papery against mine. My dear, you already are. The change began months ago. This journey is simply the next step in your growth. The following morning, standing at the airport with my carefully packed suitcase, I felt a terror unlike anything I had known. He noticed my trembling hands and quietly offered me a small packet. Open it on the plane, he said. Hours later, flying above clouds, I carefully unwrapped his gift. A delicate glass vial on a silver chain. Inside was a tiny cutting of my favorite plant from the shop, suspended in clear gel that would keep it alive indefinitely. A portable garden, read his note, So a piece of home travels with you while you discover new worlds. I fastened the chain around my neck, the vial resting above my heart, and looked out the window at the vast expanse of sky. For the first time in my life, I was leaving my carefully tended isolation behind. The cloud forests were unlike anything I had imagined. Misty, vibrant with life, filled with plants I had only seen in books. Each day brought new discoveries, new species to document, new challenges to overcome. I found myself speaking to researchers, guides, local experts. Conversations that would have terrified me weeks earlier now flowing with increasing confidence. He watched this transformation with quiet satisfaction, never commenting directly but creating space for my growth. In the evenings, as we reviewed photographs and specimens, our discussions extended beyond botany to philosophy, art, dreams, fears. "You're different here," he observed one night as we sat beneath unfamiliar stars, the forest breathing around us. "Is that good or bad?" I asked. "Neither. It's growth. The essence remains the same, but new aspects emerge in new environments, like plants adapting to different light conditions." On our final day, as we packed equipment and specimens, I realized with sudden clarity that I was not anxious to return home. Not because I didn't miss my grandmother or the shop, but because I now understood that home could expand to include more than I had allowed before. When we finally returned, stepping into the familiar scent of the flower shop, my grandmother embraced me with tears in her eyes, the first I had ever seen her shed. "Your grandfather would be so proud," she whispered. "He always said you had explorer's eyes, even as a baby." "You never told me that," I said, surprised, "because you needed to discover it yourself." That evening, as I watered my plants, I noticed subtle changes, new growth on some, different leaf patterns on others, as if they too had somehow transformed during my absence. Or perhaps I simply saw them differently now. He came by the next morning, bringing our usual coffee. "Back to normal," he said, but his tone was questioning. I touched the vial still hanging around my neck. "Not exactly normal, not anymore." "And that's okay?" I considered the question, feeling the weight of old fears against new possibilities. "I'm learning that growth isn't always visible," I said finally. "Sometimes the most important changes happen beneath the surface, in the roots." He smiled, understanding perfectly. "Speaking of which, I've been commissioned for another project. Rainforest orchids this time." "When do we leave?" I asked without hesitation. The look of joy that crossed his face was answer enough. That night, I added a new plant to my collection, a species I had discovered in the cloud forest, now carefully potted in soil from home. A hybrid existence, roots in familiar ground but branches reaching toward new skies. My grandmother watched me tend to it with knowing eyes. "Some gardens are invisible until we're ready to see them," she said softly. I touched the leaves gently, understanding at last. The garden I had been growing wasn't made of plants at all, but of possibilities, of connections, of courage to extend beyond safe boundaries. For years, I had surrounded myself with plants because they demanded nothing beyond basic care. They didn't expect conversation or emotional availability. They didn't leave if I was too quiet, too awkward, too contained. But in protecting myself from potential loss, I had also walled myself off from potential joy, from discovery, from growth of a different kind. As I placed the new plant on my windowsill, where light from the setting sun cast golden patterns through its leaves, I realized that my invisible garden was finally becoming visible. Not just to me, but to others who took the time to truly see. And for the first time in my life, I was ready to let it bloom.